I will introduce the introducer. And the introducer, hopefully, will then introduce the speaker. So I'm introducing Dmitry Nikulin. And you may think that he is a product of the SUNY system, but in fact his resume says Institute for Philosophy of the Academy of Sciences, Moscow. And that's where Dmitry comes from. And just two things I'll mention about Dmitry. These two recent books, which are really new directions and very interesting directions. The comedy book called Comedy Seriously, a Philosophical Study. And then I haven't seen, it says forthcoming here, Memory, a Philosophical History. So Dmitry, you are the introducer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So now we'll introduce Chiara. I don't know whom Chiara will introduce in turn. So we'll keep
the devil, probably.
Right. I don't think that Chiara needs much of an introduction here, but because this talk is filmed for future generations, I should introduce you, because who knows who will be watching Chiara's talk 200 years down the road. Now, Chiara came here to our department in 2010. Before that, she was at the University of Florence and got her PhD in political philosophy from European University Institute. We've been very happy to have Chiara here because she works on a wide range of various issues, but mostly all sort of concentrated around the topic of political philosophy. And she has already published 5 books. The first one was in Italian, but was also translated and published in English, called Men and States, Rethinking the Domestic Analogy in a Global Age, published in 2009. Then A Philosophy of Political Myth with Cambridge University Press in 2007, when she undertakes a very bold project of rethinking the role of myth in politics. Then she also co-authored 2 books with Benoit Chaland. One is called The Myth of the Clash of Civilizations, published in 2010, and the other, Imagining Europe, Myth, Memory, and Identity, in 2013. And then finally, her most recent book was published just last year by Columbia University Press, called Imagining Politics, Images Beyond Imagination and the Imaginary, when she discusses the role of images in contemporary politics. But today she will be talking about something different. The title of her talk is Rethinking the Biopolitical Turn, from the thanatopolitical to the geneapolitical paradigm. So please join me in welcoming Chiara.
Thank you very much, Dmitry, for your kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here, and this is a work in progress, so it's a great opportunity to be discussing this project with you, which is actually a development of some of the ideas that I've started to sketch out in my last book, Untitled Politics, but was not yet fully developed there. So it may be the beginning of a whole new book. Any comments would be therefore more than welcome. Okay, so let me begin actually by introducing the devil, Mephistopheles. In a scene from Goethe's Faust, Mephistopheles observes, quote, "For just where meaning fails, you see, a new word will come in, good and neat," end quote. New words come in where meaning fails. This is a kind of methodological assumption in this paper. We create new words or start using them in a different way when the vocabulary available no longer suffices. The task of the genealogist is therefore, in my view, very close to that of a philologist. Look for ruptures of meaning and for the interests and material processes that sustain them. Now, if it is true that a new series of words constructed with the suffix bio has recently entered our vocabulary, the question emerges, what is the failure of meaning they are responding to? What was politics before, and what has it become after what we can call the biopolitical turn? These are the questions that I would like to address today, and in order to do so, I will first try to situate the emergence of the notion of biopolitics within the more general genealogy of politics itself. I will begin by briefly recalling two major breaks in the genealogy of politics as it emerges from our Western canon, and then trying to illuminate the meaning of the appearance of the word biopolitics in this light. Specifically, I will try to argue that biopolitics has mainly been conceived within a thanatopolitical paradigm, that is, one where death is consistently privileged as the defining feature of our existential horizons. But I will also raise the question, what if birth had both an ontological and a political priority over death? Ontological because we die only as a consequence of having been born, and political because while we may die alone, we are always necessarily born, at least in company of somebody else. If human beings are conceived as being after birth, rather than beings towards death, as in the thanatopolitical paradigm, a different perspective emerges. One that, from the Greek genia politics, I would like to call geneapolitical. So, first step, the genealogy of politics. And the first break I'm going to focus on is the very invention of politics. It's well known that the meaning of the term politics has significantly changed from one epoch to the other. What is less known, at least outside the circle of historians, is that politics has not always been there. If one looks at the history of the term, one cannot but be struck by the fact that it is a modern invention. Despite the Greek derivation from the adjective politikos, generally indicating whatever concerned the polis, the use of the substantive politics is a typically modern phenomenon. The striking rupture emerges clearly if we consider that the ancient Greeks did not even have a word that corresponds to our politics. For them, there existed the polis, the concrete city-state they live in, ta politica, the substantivized version of the adjective politikos, denoting in general all what pertains to the polis, and politike techne, which denotes the art of leading political affairs. But both these expressions, ta politica and politike techne, refer to the sphere of the polis, broadly understood as the site of public life, and not to a specific kind of activity within public life. As a consequence, it is not an exaggeration to say that the Greeks, to which so many philosophers attributing the invention of politics, did not have a word to designate it. This, of course, does not mean that one cannot use their experience as a model for what politics is or should be. You can have the thing and not name it, or have it and name it differently. However, we should be aware that when we speak about the Greek understanding of politics, we do so with a word that was invented at a much later stage. Strictly speaking, it is an anachronism. And the invention of politics, this is my argument, signals that something new had in the meanwhile emerged, something that the available vocabulary was insufficient to designate. By contrast, in their own daily usage, ancient Greeks felt that the polis, the concrete space where they were engaged in public life, was sufficient to designate the activities we would normally term politics. When the ancient Greeks wanted to speak about it in more abstract terms, they did not feel the need for politics, but most often use an expression, ta politica, that denote both the things relative to the polis and the knowledge about those things. And it is significant for us that the other expression most often used, politike techne, also means both the thing and the knowledge about it. And this is a point worth emphasizing before we move on, if not for other reasons, at least because it's to a great extent thanks to the translation of Aristotle's books on politics called Ta Politica, that the word politics will enter our vocabulary. But this is something that, as I'm now going to argue, happens only very, very late in comparison to the Greek epoch. Now, the lack of a word for politics in ancient Greek is something that cannot but strike the genealogist as a philologist. But even more puzzling is the complete absence of such a word from classical Latin, and therefore also from a lot of the Latin Christianity. The ancient Romans, according to some, the most political of all ancient people, did not feel the need for the word politics. Even more so, in classical Latin, there is not even the adjective politicus, for which the Greeks had the adjective politikos. And this is perhaps the most puzzling twist in our story so far. The Romans, who imported so many things from the Greek and from their vocabulary, did not feel the need to import politikos. Like the Greeks, they did not have a substantive that corresponds to our politics. However, neither did they have an adjective corresponding to our political. The Romans had their own words and perhaps also their own different things. They had the adjective civilis, publicus, and socialis, and the substantives res publica, literally the public thing, publica negotia, the public affairs, and the res civilis. Now, I cannot enter here the detail of the birth of politics, the term politics, but what is important to emphasize is the fact that it is indeed a decisively modern invention. In this respect, the rupture from previous usages could not be greater. For some, this path-breaking innovation is the result of the curious fact that when Wilhelm von Moerbeke translated Aristotle's books on politics, the thanatopolitical, into Latin, he did not use the standard word that Latin had used for centuries, socialis, civilis, publicus, but directly imported from Greek the term politicus and also the substantive politica. Among the term imported by von Moerbeke, there is therefore not just the adjective politicus, but also the substantive. Simply left it in a Latinized version, so politica instead of ta politica. A choice that for the time was quite eccentric, because it went against the usage of centuries of Latin Christianity. Thus, the question emerges, is the birth of politics just the result of an inaccuracy? And even if this interpretation is correct, and the birth of politics derives from what in the end was a bad translation, this still doesn't explain why this bad translation eclipsed all the other terms throughout the century. Furthermore, the very fact that von Moerbeke was uncertain about the usage of the term and felt the need to import ta politica, with a slightly different Latinized version, is perhaps the sign that the political word of the 13th century in which he was writing could not be rendered through the words that Latin writers had used in the previous millennium. On the other hand, the fact that the word politica comes into modern Latin through a translation of Aristotle's Politics will not come as a surprise. The translation of Aristotle's political masterpiece, which does not predate the 13th century, so it's pretty late, proved to be a particularly powerful weapon to support the autonomy of a worldly authority in a context where the central political battle was still the confrontation with the supporter of the authority of the church. If the polis derives from the fact that, as Aristotle put it, man is a zon politikon, then it is rooted in human nature and possesses, therefore, its own autonomy. By the 14th century, this argument will become crucial for the opponents of political Augustinism, that is, of the idea that, as Augustine put it, without divine justice, human political association can only be magna latrocinia, that is, gangs of criminals. Nonetheless, despite this late medieval appearance of the word politics, we should not forget that for centuries the term continued to be used in the ancient meaning of the science of government. Like the corresponding terms physics or economics, the term politics has been used for a very long time to denote mainly the works devoted to the study of politics and not the thing itself. Decisive moment for the birth of politics in our sense is, according to some interpreters, in particular Maurizio Viroli, due to the revolution initiated at the dawn of modernity by the theorists of the reason of state. With this expression, Botero referred to the knowledge of the appropriate means to establish, maintain, and enlarge a state, defined as a firm empire over a people. It's only with this revolution that the term politics ceases to have its ancient meaning of civil philosophy and instead starts to assume the specifically modern meaning of the art of preserving the state or of the activity taking place within it. So behind the fortune of a translator's seemingly chance introduction of the term politics into Latin, there is therefore a failure of meaning perceived vis-à-vis the emergence of a radical political novelty, which is the novelty of the modern sovereign state, understood, as I've just mentioned, as a firm dominion over a people and within a specific territory. Now, the modern state, whose appearance in Europe is controversial as regards the periodization, was indeed an unprecedented form of political community, whose novelty is more strongly apparent if one considers that medieval Europe had been characterized for centuries by a chaotic and overlapping systems of authority, where no political power could claim authority over a defined territory. In other words, it's only in order to designate and emphasize the important novelty of this emerging institution that the passage from a knowledge of the thing, politics as civil philosophy, to the thing itself, politics as the activity itself, took place. Now, wherever one locates the birth of the term politics and the emergence of the modern state, it's clear that the emergence of politics and its becoming common denote a significant semantic shrinkage of the term. I don't have the space, nor perhaps even the need, to discuss all the vicissitude of the term. Let me just mention that Hobbes was credited to a large extent to have invented modern English philosophical language, because before him Latin was the language of philosophy. Does not use the word politics. When he wants to speak about politics, he uses the word commonwealth, a literal translation of the res publica. Same goes for Spinoza, same for Machiavelli, to whom I will go back towards the end of my paper. What I would like to emphasize is that by the time Max Weber, for instance, will take up the term at the beginning of the 20th century, politics will be reduced to a really minimal semantic core. No longer a knowledge about the whole of public life, but rather a small part of the thing itself. That is, that peculiar kind of power characterized by the potential recourse to the use of legitimate physical coercion. Now, Weber was obsessed with definitions, and perhaps this explains why his definition, including that of politics, have been so prominent in the literature and so influential. But for our genealogy, I think it's important to emphasize and keep in mind that the success of a definition of politics that tend to reduce it to the state is inseparable from the fact that it clearly reflected a crucial change in political life itself. It's because of the emergence of the modern state, an unprecedented form of political community, that people felt the need for a new word. When confronted with such a novelty and with what public life had become within modern states, people felt a sense of novelty, and politics happened to be the term that they choose to convey this novelty. Now, in relation to such a restricted view of politics and to this process of restriction of the semantic field, many political thinkers felt constrained. The resistance towards this restriction heralds the second break in the genealogy of politics that I would like to emphasize today. Different authors, in the belief that something had been lost in this restriction, looked back to classical antiquity and tried to expand the concept again using classical antiquity as a model, whereas others looked elsewhere and coined different concepts and different words. I cannot enter the detail of all of this, but among the former, let me mention Hannah Arendt, given that we are at the New School, who notoriously saw in the Athenian model of democracy a model for what politics is or should be, whereas among the new words, I would like to mention, although quickly, the concept of the political. Why I'm mentioning this concept? Because I think the emergence and the fortune of the notion of the political interestingly point and gesture a return to the adjective. The adjective which, as we have seen, goes back a long way from modernity. However, the emphasis in the political is now interestingly shifted towards the substantivized form, the political. Reflecting on the meaning of this shift, for instance, Rosanne Vallon argues that it implied a very deep change of perspective, that is a change from politics understood as the Weberian struggle for the monopoly over legitimate coercion to an examination of the background, of the ontological condition that makes politics in the Weberian sense possible in the first place. Again, can't enter the details here, but you see the enlargement. Right? Now, with these two breaks in mind, so first, the invention of politics and the restriction of its semantic field, and the second break, various attempts to broaden again the meaning of politics, we can now turn to biopolitics. The term, most notably used by Foucault in the 70s, has gained actually prominence very recently in public debate, and I can talk more about the details of its fortune, but it doesn't predate the last 10 years as a blossom. Biopolitics, together with all the other terms constructed with the suffix bio, bioethics, biolaw, biomedicine, biotechnology, bioterrorism, biowar, bioweapon, bioeconomy, the list is ever expanding. I can't do justice to it, but has invaded our vocabulary. For us, it's interesting to note, in the light of the genealogy of politics, that the notion of biopolitics maintains, on the one hand, the typically modern attention to the institutional mechanism of power, while at the same time enlarging it to include a kind of knowledge, as was the case for the ancient meaning of the term. To put it bluntly, politics is both for Weber and Foucault something that has to do with power, but with this fundamental difference. For Foucault, power is pervasive because it is inseparable from knowledge. As a consequence, like the political, the emergence of the term biopolitics also signals a decisive enlargement. Now, let us now see, and this is going to be the remaining of my paper, what is at stake here and why such an enlargement was perceived as necessary. For Foucault, such an enlargement, and thus the term biopolitics, was probably needed to denote what he perceived as a deep change in the nature of modern political power. In his view, while classical sovereignty was a power aimed at controlling life by threatening it with the possibility of death, the new form of power that emerges in the mid-19th century is that of a power aimed at inciting and preserving life. As he openly put it, while the sovereign power, crucially symbolized by the sword, was essentially a power to kill, a power to take life or let it die, the new biopower manifests itself as a power to make live and let die. Hence the increased significance of biological life as a medium where political power displays itself. So in Foucault's analysis, it's indeed in the 19th century that the power's hold over life emerges. At least this is the moment when the biological came under the state control, or at least the moment where the tendency towards state control of the biological becomes particularly crucial. In this reconstruction, the rise of biopolitics is thus manifested in the systematic inclusion of disciplines such as demography, public hygiene, birth control, etc. in the practice of government itself. This change attests to an attempt by political power to directly control life, not simply by threatening to inflict death, the power of the sword, but also by inciting, promoting, in other words, by disciplining life itself. So while in Foucault there is therefore a big difference between classical forms of sovereignty and biopolitics, Giorgio Agamben has emphasized how biopolitics is inscribed in the bones of modernity from its very inception. In his view, the paradox of modern sovereignty is precisely that it has always been at the same time within and outside the juridical order, because its power derives from its capacity to decide on the state of exception and therefore to inflict death on its very subject. While the modern paradigm, at least since Hobbes, has justified the existence of sovereign power in terms of its capacity to guarantee the security of its citizen, Agamben reveals the striking paradox at its core. The sovereign is the sovereign because it can guarantee our security by potentially killing us with impunity. In that respect, as the title of his work reminds us, we are all homines sacri, that is, sacred men, sacrificial human beings, which, like the corresponding figure in Roman law, can be killed with impunity. Agamben can therefore claim that authentically political becomes at this point bare life itself, since the sovereign who retained the right to kill with impunity is at the same time inside and outside the juridical order. And this is particularly evident in its capacity to decide on the state of exception that makes the Nazi concentration camp not a deviation from modernity, but rather the epitome of its very biopolitical paradigm. Whereas the ancient Greek could, in his view, still distinguish between zoe, bare life, and bios, the qualified life, this possibility would be lost for us because life itself becomes the political questions par excellence. It's a small reconstruction of Agamben for those who are not familiar with it. What is important for me to emphasize here is the fact that despite the fact that Agamben locates the birth of biopolitics at the very beginning of modernity, he nevertheless agrees with Foucault fundamentally inside. That is, whereas for millennia mind remained what it was for Aristotle, I'm here paraphrasing from Foucault, that is, a living animal with the additional capacity for political existence, the specifically modern man is, for Foucault and for Agamben, an animal whose politics places his existence as a living being in question. Not by chance, then, racist politics, in particular Nazism, is for both authors a kind of culminating point. Nazism took the interplay between the sovereign right to kill and the mechanism of biopower that is inscribed in the state to the point of the extermination camp. Otherwise said, for both authors, biopolitics culminate in a form of thanatopolitics. It's not surprising, for instance, that Achille Mbembe has summarized Foucault and Agamben's understanding of modern sovereignty by saying that it is a form of necropolitics. As he observed, quote, sovereignty resides in this paradigm in the power and the capacity to dictate who may live and who must die. Hence, to kill or to allow to live constitute the limits of sovereignty, its fundamental attributes. To exercise sovereignty is to exercise control over mortality and to define life as a deployment and manifestation of power. End quote. Precisely because, this is at least how I read Mbembe, the biopolitical nature of modern sovereignty expresses itself in such a right to dictate who can live and who must die, racism has to be a crucial ingredient of modern politics from its very inception. Far from being an aberration within the Western road to freedom and rationality, the Nazi concentration camp would therefore simply be an extension into the European ground of the very biopolitical technique that the West had been practicing in its colony for a long time, be it either through colonization and the extermination of the entire native people, or through the domination of slave bodies in the plantation systems. Now, although Bembe's post-colonial reading of Foucault and Agamben would deserve more space than it's possible for me to devote here, I think it's relevant to note, and this is the only point I would like to make about this reading, how easily Agamben and Foucault lend themselves to a necropolitical reading of biopolitics. So the question I would like to raise is this the only way to conceive of biopolitics? And more specifically, does biopolitics always have to negate life while sustaining and disciplining it? Roberto Esposito has taken a different road, for instance, and he has tried to reverse what he calls the thanatopolitical paradigm of Nazism into its opposite, and thus to elaborate an affirmative model of biopolitics that configure politics not as a power over life, sulla vita, but as a power of life, della vita. And I think there are very interesting direction of research is pointing towards, but I think that he ultimately doesn't manage to do what he plans to do, that is to revert this thanatopolitical paradigm, as it's evidenced, for instance, in the fact that even in Bios, where he tries to speak about birth, he constantly brings birth back to the fact that we are going to die. For instance, he introduced birth as the moment where we are actually confronted with our own fragility, that is, with the fact that we are going to die. And more in general, I think there is a kind of Heideggerian heritage in his thinking, which emerges in his thinking about the political communities as always conceived in terms of our fragility as human beings, that derives from the fact that we are ultimately being towards death. And I think although he tries to move to more vitalistic type of philosophy and away from this Heideggerian heritage, he ultimately doesn't manage, but we can go back to it in the discussion. Nevertheless, this emphasis on death, I think, is an attitude that goes well beyond Agamben and Esposito. Feminist philosophers like Adriana Cavarero have been emphasizing that it's indeed a more general tendency of philosophers, at least since Plato, to constantly look at human beings as fundamentally brotoi, mortals, beings towards death. Very rarely, she observed, did they take the opposite perspective of looking at them as being after birth, a puzzling fact on its own, given the ontological priority of birth over death. For while it is true that we are being toward death, it's equally true that we are so because we are in the first place beings after birth. Philosophers, for some reason, like to remind us of the first fact, that we are going to die, but they tend to forget of the second one, that is, that we are born. Now, these, however, are crucial consequences for the way in which the whole discussion on politics is framed, because looking at human beings from the perspective of death means looking at them in a very specific way. In the first place, it leads to a neglect of the difference between bodies that can bear life and bodies that cannot do so, and the consistent way in which people like Agamben, to some extent Foucault, and Esposito himself have neglected the gender nature of bodies is indeed striking. Looking at human beings as primarily being after birth not only brings to the fore the fact that bodies are never gender neutral, but also point to the fact that this leads to a very peculiar view of human beings. Death indeed is one of the very few events in our life where we are alone, whereas birth, on the contrary, is always in company with somebody else. Now, of course, you will reply, death, like any other event, is a social event. It can be more or less witnessed. You don't die really if your death is not witnessed. But to put it bluntly, let's say I can now go back to my office, take out a gun, sit down in all solitude, shoot my head, give myself death. Notwithstanding all of our fantasies, I cannot go back to my office in all solitude and give myself birth. So there's something, phenomenologically speaking, of a difference between the two events. And I do think that there's a tendency to forget the fact that the body that dies alone is always born in company of somebody else, at least a donor sperm in our context. We can give death to ourselves in some way. We can anticipate, we can give it to us, whereas we cannot give birth to ourselves. It's something that we have to receive. But despite the peculiarity of death vis-a-vis other events of human life, and in particularly birth, it's the moment to which most philosophers have concentrated their attention. Not by chance, the term brotoi has become in philosophy, from Greek philosophy onwards, a synonym for human being. What are human beings? They are mortals. According to Adriana Cavarero, philosophers tend to privilege death because they conceive of philosophy as an activity that unties the soul from its bodily imprisonment, deriving from birth itself. And while women are confined in the space of the body, philosophy becomes the activity that prepares men for the liberation of the soul for such an imprisonment, and therefore ultimately for death. It's almost a common place to say that philosophy is a preparation for death. I'd like to see more of a philosophy which is a preparation for, birth, right? Or accepting the fact that we are born. In some, it's because of a deeply entrenched body-soul dualism, this is a Cavarero argument, which all too often help to relegate women in the sphere of body needs, that philosophers have so consistently privileged death. However, and this is my argument, if we take the opposite road and look at human beings as beings after birth, and if we take this perspective seriously, then I think a whole different series of considerations come to the front. First, on a very general philosophical level, it becomes evident that life has always been at the center of politics, not only because life and its needs are crucial political issues, but also because, as Arendt put it, birth itself is the political moment par excellence. If it is true that death is the moment where we are necessarily alone, whereas birth is always in common, then we have to conclude that birth, rather than death, pace esposito, should be at the center of our thinking about politics. We can die more or less surrounded by other people, even commit collective suicide, but it is a fact that our body can die alone, whereas our birth is always in company of at least another body. To put it in Arendt's term, natality is the miracle that saved the world, the realm of human affairs, from its normal natural ruin. The fact that newborn constantly comes to the world not only explains, in her view, how the new is possible, but also how and why plurality comes about. And if politics presupposes plurality, a plurality of body, then we must conclude that birth comes well before death as the crucial political moment. The fact that this basic truth has so often been neglected does not only have to do with the circumstance that philosophers, historically speaking, were mainly male. Having gone through the experience of birth only at the beginning of their life, it's also too easy to understand why they tend to forget about it. And a very different genealogy would probably have been written if women had a larger role in actually writing it. But what I want to emphasize is the fact that if we take this perspective, like let's call it geneapolitical, then it becomes immediately clear that the power exercised over women's body which were for a long time the only ones capable of bearing life, has never been the pure power of the sword, admitting that any pure power of the sword would ever be possible. It has always been biopower, because it has always been a power essentially aimed at inciting, sustaining, and disciplining life. And notice here that I'm not only thinking of the individual life, but also of the life of the population, of the body politics. By emphasizing the juridical mechanism of modern sovereignty, but the biopolitical thinkers I've mentioned before, I think they have all too often implicitly assumed the typically modern juridical fiction of a gender-neutral bearer of rights. But there is a huge difference between being a homo sacer, a sacred man, or a femina sacra, that is, a sacred woman, right? Power just is exercised in a different way. Otherwise said, to put it in Carol Bateman words, behind the social contract, there has always been a sexual contract whereby the bodies of women were disciplined, controlled, in a way made live, and even made for life. So Agamben is right, perhaps, in saying that what is authentically political is life itself, but this is not because it is killable in the first place. I think it is political because it is born. So, and if you look at biopolitics from the point of view of women, I think we cannot but conclude that modern politics is biopolitical because it is geneapolitical before being thanatopolitical. Again, here I'm counterposing genia, the Greek word for birth, to thanatos, the Greek word for death. Now, in just the last step of this paper, instead of going through an impossible list of all the disciplinary practice through which menstruating women, pregnant women, producing women went through, something that feminist historians will do much better than I can do justice here, I would like to show the entanglement between modern politics and the biopolitics of women's body by focusing on a notoriously not feminist philosopher, Niccolò Machiavelli. Great supporter of the importance of force for politics, Machiavelli is also clearly aware of the fact that it is not through the power of the sword that politics is exercised over female bodies. This particularly emerges if we look both at his political and his literary writing. For instance, the fact that the Mandrake, his literary masterpiece, must be read in continuity with the Prince has all too often been neglected. As Pitkin observes, this is because women do not or very rarely appear in Machiavelli's political writing, and they are safely confined in Machiavelli plays and poetry, with the result that whereas political theories tend to focus on the political writing, the literary writing are left to literary theories. Now, while the Prince theorizes the autonomy of politics by pointing to the crucial role of political virtues, the unfolding of the whole argument is constantly threatened by the appearance of the unknown and what Machiavelli conveyed through the term fortuna, fortune. As we read in the puzzling 25th chapter of The Prince, fortune is what can potentially ruin even the most prudent and virtuous prince. It is, quote, one of those dangerous rivers that when they become enraged, they flood the plains, destroy trees, buildings, move earth from one place and deposit in another, end quote. In the face of such a power, this unknown power, fortune that can destroy even the most virtuous prince, Machiavelli says we can only try to constrain it by building dikes and dams. After providing some provisional, but I think also in the end an effective advice on the way in which the prince can try to contain fortuna, Machiavelli moves from the metaphor of the river to another very recurrent metaphor in his writing. Fortune, he says, is a woman. I quote from the prince: "Fortune is a woman, and if you want to control her, it's necessary to treat her roughly." End quote. Now, I'm quoting from the English translation of The Prince by Quentin Skinner and Russell Price, Cambridge University Press, 1988. But I would like to emphasize that there is a whole erotic dimension in this passage that just get lost in this translation. The Italian original sounds quite different. It says, "La fortuna è donna ed è necessario, volendola tenere sotto, batterla ed urtarla." Besides the invitation to activity, and which is typical of Machiavelli temperament and kind of phallic, energetic language, we should know that all the Italian terms that Machiavelli uses have a clear sexual connotation. Tenerla sotto means keep her under, refers to the sexual position of women. Batterla evokes the rhythm of sexual intercourse. Urtarla literally means you have to hit her. All these are terms that at the time were used with a clear sexual connotation. Now, and it's interesting that it's a whole erotic dimension that just is lost in translation. So, and I think it's important to bring it back to the conversation. It is indeed a puzzling metaphor, right? Why to conclude The Prince with this idea that fortune is a woman? I mean, what it means to say that fortune is a woman, and why, in order to constrain her, right, you have to actually make sex to her. Many contrasting answers have been given, but it has often been neglected that, to a great extent, I think the Mandrake, written probably, there's some debate about it, but a couple of years after The Prince, contains a direct answer to the question, what it means that you have, to contain fortune by making sex with her. Let me briefly recall the plot of the Mandrake, which I think is Machiavelli, not just Machiavelli, but is the greatest masterpiece in Italian Renaissance writing. Lucrezia, the heroine of the play, is known for her beauty, which has led Callimaco to leave Paris and come back to Florence to seduce her. Unfortunately, she is also known for her chastity. She's married to the elderly and rich Nietzsche, to whom she's said to be extremely faithful. But besides being stupid, Nietzsche is also very eager to receive a son, and Lucrezia has not been able to give him one. So to realize his dream, Callimaco, who embodies all the virtues of the Machiavellian prince, enlists the aid of a parasite, a friar, Lucrezia's mother, and managed to persuade Nietzsche that the first person who's going to sleep with his wife after she has taken this mandrake potion will die. So Nietzsche, in the end, agrees to put Callimachus in the bed with his very beautiful and chaste wife. The only difficulty proves to be to persuade Lucrezia, the heroine of the play, who is presented at the beginning of the play as so virtuous that, I quote, she is fit to rule even a kingdom, end quote. It is only in front of the erudite argument of the doctor who has studied science in France and to the pastoral power of the friar that she finally consents to what she nevertheless perceived as a vituperio, an Italian word that almost means rape, right? As we learn from Machiavelli next play, Clizia, the union will be blessed, Nietzsche will receive a son, which guarantees the continuity of the family, but also the continuity of the polity. As for Lucrezia, she also seems to gain something, as she says at the end of the play to Callimaco, and I quote, "Since your cleverness, my husband's stupidity, my mother's silliness, and my confessor guile have led me to do what I never would have done by myself, I have to judge that this comes from divine providence that wills so. I am not capable of refusing what heaven itself wants me to accept. I therefore take you, Callimaco, as my lord, my master and my guide. You shall act as a father for me and protector for me, and I will be yours completely forever. What my husband has willed for one night, he shall have for good and forever." End quote. So Lucrezia may have gained something, a lover and a son, but she also has lost something else. She, who at the beginning of the play was presented as so wise that she could actually govern a kingdom, has now joyfully submitted to the delight of being governed. Callimaco, on the other hand, has proved to be the perfect incarnation of Machiavelli's prince, whose puzzling concluding metaphor, "Fortune is a woman," is now worth to quote more at length. Go back to the prince. The whole passage sounds, "I certainly think that it is better to be impetuous than cautious, because fortune is a woman, and if you want to control her, it's necessary to treat her roughly. And it is clear that she's more inclined to yield to men who are impetuous than to those who are calculating. Since fortune is a woman, she's well disposed towards young men, because they are less cautious and they are more aggressive. Therefore, they treat her more boldly." End quote. Constrained like a river within the dikes of the household, Lucrezia, like all other women of the time, experiences power, primarily in the form of biopower, as a power that takes hold over life, over her own life, but also over the life that she has the capacity to bear. And this is because it's ultimately from women's bodies that the continuity of Nietzsche's family, as well as the continuity of the Republic, depends. So, moving toward the conclusion, we can say that by inverting the Foucauldian rephrasing of Aristotle, women have always been animals in whose politics place their existence as living being in question. Politics, in this sense, has always been biopolitical, because in whatever way we want to conceive of it, it is our existence as living being who have been born that is in question. Otherwise stated, politics is biopolitical because, as I've tried to argue, is geneapolitical before being thanatopolitical. Something that, if we look at this from the point of view of women body, I think we cannot fail to notice. Now, at this point of the argument, one may rightly ask, if politics has always been biopolitical, why do we need this term now? One reason, I think, is capitalism's tendency to intensify this link between politics and life. Through the technological development of the last few decades and incorporation of life in the mechanism of production itself, human beings have become able to penetrate the inner mechanism of life in a way that was not the case before. The term biopolitics emerges thus to signify the increased capacity of the state to appropriate the power over biological life, just as the birth of modern state gave to politics an autonomy that it did not have before, at least not to such a degree, thus justifying the birth of a new term, politics, in that context. So equally, the capitalist transformations of our time have determined a biopolitical turn that now calls for a new series of concepts. Biopolitics and geneapolitics, two of them. This is perhaps something that Foucault would agree with. I mean, the idea that the concept of biopolitics is needed because there has been an intensification of the power's hold over life. But it still remains the case that, in my view, it tends to neglect how differently biopolitical technique impact differently gendered bodies. So much so that it does not make any sense when one brings these differences to the fore to speak about a classical age of sovereignty when power was supposed to be only the power of the sword. The power exercised over women's body has always been biopolitical, and it has never been the pure power of the sword. I think it's only if we look at human beings as mainly being toward death as opposed as being after birth that we can ignore this difference. What has changed in the current context, I think, is the all-gender inclusive nature of biopolitical techniques. And this is the enlargement that we are witnessing, and particularly in the last 10 years, which happen also to be the years when the term biopolitics has blossomed. In sum, if it is true that life has always been crucial to politics, it has never been to the degree that it is today, and in particular, it has never been to the gender-inclusive way that it is today. Let me conclude with a famous aphorism on the limits of political power, which Bottici borrowed from an 18th century writer and made famous, and which reads as follows. Quote, "It is a fundamental principle with English lawyers that a parliament can do everything but make a woman a man and a man a woman." End quote. We live in an epoch when, on the contrary, parliaments can and indeed do legislate about sex change. So we can no longer expect nature to put a limit to political power in the way in which an 18th century writer could do. It is to see as such a novelty, I believe, as well as the failure of the available vocabulary to designate this novelty, that a new word has emerged and blossomed. As Mephistopheles, the devil, would say, good at need. Thank you.